Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome again to another podcast episode on Talk Architecture with your host, Naziaty Mohd Yaacob. I have been thinking about the series of episodes based on the topic of the dumbing down of architecture education. And I've been quoting from different sources to discuss about aspects in architecture education that seems to be, shall we say, critical. Then I looked at and I listened to again the podcast that I had a conversation with Kevin Marlowe on the balanced education model, part 1 and 2. And the points that were addressed in part 2 was on formalism, relationships, and guidance. So that's the topic for today. Architecture, education, and in terms of what is formalism, what does it mean when Kevin was discussing about that? What does it mean from my perspective? Because I'm just picking out those keywords that were addressed in part 2 of that conversation I had with Kevin. Apart from that, we did deal with the Malaysian Architecture Week review, talking about hero worshipping, awards, and so on. So these are actually things that we go around and around again, but it's always good to go deeper. And looking at the definition of formalism, which is an excessive adherence to prescribed forms. And in any attitudes, any subject matter which emphasizes on formalism, be it in academia or in practice. When Kevin Marlowe was saying about there is too much obsession with formalism and having an identity to build a brand, giving, quote, false confidence, unquote, to a graduate. Now, I'm just trying to get a handle on this word formalism and how that happens, starting from the first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year. If you hang around enough in those crits, in those studio education, and the issues on styles and identity, and it makes sense when people ask for the wow factor. They're asking, what are you drawing? What do you have to offer? How are you different than other people? What do you stand by? What are you about? So they have 3 labs. Now I'm looking at what has transpired in my previous university, School of Architecture. They had these labs, and I had a lab as well when I was an academic. In the last time I was there, it was 2022. But I didn't have a lab at that time. But the time when I did have a lab, I wasn't really concerned about the theme. My lab was about community architecture, but it was just something to say and not be thought out as a crucial thing to depict or identify with. But it's very general in talking about, because Kevin Marlowe was the leading tutor he led the studio. I was the full-time academic that assists with the idea of the studio. And the way that we run the studio is we chose an area. The last time we chose was the University of Malaya campus, but we didn't finish with that group. And then previous to that, we chose Petaling Jaya, Old Town. Now, what was brilliant about it was having this team and having the students with us and doing all those things, like I said earlier, identifying design problems and getting the students to be more and more confident. We strip away the idea of asking the student what architectural style, or what are you at, what are you about. We just focus on the design problem, on the building type, on the urban issues, on how people move about, if it's a public building, and the details of it, and the architecture as purely an architecture education should be. We were not obsessed with formalism, for sure. Going back to that definition of adherence to prescribed forms. May that form be the architectural form, or the way that you have to portray yourself or perform in being an architecture graduate. No, it's like you know your skills and you build your confidence, and from not being confident at the beginning of the design thesis project, you know very little when you were in the fourth year. You went into fifth year and you went into this rigorous training over and over every week to come up and show up and challenge your greatest fears. There is no time for formalism or a brand identity. We're not going to talk about, we're not going to be fussy about only one aspect. Aesthetics are there, form making are there, if we need or necessary to go into it, and the architecture calls for it, or the thesis calls for it. But we're not necessarily going to have a prescribed, when we talk about formalism, we talk about prescribed forms, meaning a prescribed way of looking at education in a way that you got to do this, tick the boxes. Where is that? Have you done that? Where is this? Even if we ask the question, where is that drawing? It is more like we're gonna talk about this. We're gonna have a conversation. We're gonna unpack it. Meaning it could be so construed in the way that the students are stuck with it. Let's unpack it. We're searching the designer during the crit. Usually it's an interim or a group crit where we're gathered around, or when we're on one-to-one situation with students. I've often looked at students' work and I say, shall I say, where you want to go with this? There's always that process that is driving the students a step after they meet up with you. And if they don't ask outrightly any question to you, they don't ask, they haven't asked a question, you just show something. So, okay, that looks like, you have done so and so, and did you, because it's all about concepts, isn't it? And theory, relating to theory, but we're looking more at concepts of a different thing, concept of a hospital, concept of a church, concept of a mosque or wet market. So it's to do with your intervention or what you think you want to do to this, having added programs to it and taking out other programs and doing your analysis from and doing a synthesis of what you're thinking you're doing. So when you see the face of the student being unsatisfied with their work, where is it coming from? A lot of it is just unpacking how you feel about your project in a way that I often say that you be three things. Often you be the coach, the consultant, or the expert on a certain topic that the student raised, or you find another expert. But consultant meaning the architect or some mentor, some guidance. And in Kevin Matlow's conversation on the balanced education model, part 2, he mentioned about guidance. It's not a collaboration, he would criticize the word that I had, but I had in mind that actually I made some analysis that I asked students after they finish with a thesis later on, whether it's 50-50 or 70-30 collaboration with the lecturers. And they often answer that because I think that in a way, the feeling from the student is different from the feeling from the tutor, in which they do listen to you and they do act upon what you suggest or react to it if they don't agree. So there is a dialogue happening, a conversation happening between you and the student. And I thought the right word was collaboration, but actually Kevin said, no, it's about guidance from a tutor, providing proper mentorship. So it was in the context of not just influences, but okay, I'm just specifically going to the studio, not actually talking about in general people get influenced by others. But okay, it's okay. We go back to students to be more critical thinking, more adopting a more critical approach as a designer and thinker. Or even the teacher is needed also to have that guide for the students to be thinking critically. So that third point, the guidance, that is in this podcast episode is what is necessary from the day to day. Like I said, either you're a coach, consultant, or an expert. And when you understand your role, at some times you have more of a coach. Not a life coach, obviously. If they want, it's later on, but definitely a coach at that time when they're doing the thesis. And in being that coach, you gotta ask questions like, where are you, what you need, how you're gonna get to the other point. Have you looked into this? Have you looked into that? Strengthen this, strengthen the weakness. Have you made yourself, have you done your, shall we say, your rehearsal? Have you listed the design problems so that you can present your work carefully? Have you realized, this is coach. Coach sees things that perhaps students don't and trying to remind them. Where the consultant is, the student will come up with, how do I detail the roof? Or, so you could be proactive and you say your project is a building type that has to do the market. So have you detailed out certain things that is the thesis for a market or a library or so on, yeah? So as a consultant, you can say, oh, you should design this. This is how to design. So why don't you try to do the detail of the roof and let's see what you got? And a critique will happen in terms of the architecture. The second one was what Kevin was talking a lot on, which is the focus that need to be on the power relationships when dealing with building type. For example,
Looking for creative inspiration? Graphite Pro Radio explores the intersection of design, culture, and innovation, one conversation at a time. Join us for deep dives into the creative process and game-changing ideas. Start listening today.
When you're designing an airport, if you were to say an airport is a gateway to the city, it's cliche in a way, and it's not helping you to actually frame things in your mind and becoming clearer. And that's one of the things that the mentor is doing with the students, helping them to be clearer and clearer about the confusion that they've learned before, perhaps relearning or unlearning things. So when they approach with a building type like an airport, the biggest problem, or the biggest design problem, is how to accommodate a large volume of people. For transportation hubs, during peak hours or during times when a very large amount of people is going through, there are the numbers, there are the halls, there is the feeling of whether you feel that you're crowded out or you feel that stifled by just a group. And how do you actually create choices for them? How do you get them from point A to point B so that they won't get stuck in point A and making, a blockage and stuff like that? And it's how do you design an airport? So when you look at a building type, the focus is on the power of relationships. Relationship mean in the gist of it all, we always talk about relationships, right? Family relationships, shall we say, romantic relationships or friends or whatever. So in architecture, in the context of architecture, what is a relationship? When you define relationship as the way two or more people are connected or the way they behave toward each other, then in the context of being in an airport with many, many people, is that we are drowned in people. I mean, if there is to do with connection, then do you want interaction between people, or do you want them to they have choice to be on their own, or you just want to process? Because it's going to be boring, right? The whole subject of travel from destination A, B, C, D, go through the counter, check in, then you go and have your meal, and then you wait, and then you check for time, and then you go in to board through the immigration controls, and then you get to the other side. I mean, the sense of being with other people, encounters that could happen, the needs of different people, how you want to be comfortable as well. So when we talk about relationships and how we are connected in an airport, how we're connected in a library, how we're connected in the marketplace. When we talk about the market, the wet market, the whole idea of going to buy your groceries for the day and meeting up with your friends and having your breakfast at the market, and that's interesting to observe and design for the power relationships. The power meaning you could give people power when you establish relationships and when you're dealing with certain building types. So Karen did mention about understanding rather than just looking at a series of relationships. that led me to that tool that we have students doing, and I was also using that tool, the matrix of relationships. And then we put in the function of the spaces, or the spaces, living, dining, for a house, kitchen, toilet, bedroom, and then the relationship of the main entrance is having nothing to do with the bedroom, because you have to go through a series of space before you go to the bedroom. And so we did that matrix of relationship between the spaces, right? So is intrinsically or done, or the students of architecture just have a gut feeling about this and that related to each other because they went to do a case study. For a thesis, you go and do a case study on the building type, right? If it's a school, you visit a school, you interview and so on. But how do you actually ask questions about what is out there, the case study, how are you going to change things, and why do you want to change things willy-nilly? There are reasons and there are research on why you want to propose something. So it goes back to the design problem again, Your observation shows that this is the problem. And then you discuss that with your tutor, with your mentors, your studio tutors. And then sometimes your teacher will say, no, that's not really a problem. Or make you think about it more. And you mull over it. And you come back the following week after you've done some research. Or you just mull over it. So I'm coming to the conclusion here about this topic on formalism, relationships, and guidance in architecture education, or specifically the design studio, and the one-to-one interaction between the tutors and the students. I'm looking back into the dumbing down of architecture education, the topics that we had with regard to the architecture fraternity or the academics, and how a school is run, and why we have, one of the topics was the employers or the companies were not happy with the graduates. So if the employers got the graduates and felt that they don't have it in them, or they lack in skills, something is the problem with interpersonal relationship skills. Something is a problem in terms of expressing themselves and knowing what to do. So that wasn't being taught in architecture school. You can have a theoretical architecture school. You can have a much more technical. You can have a much more, they have different types of school, right? They used to say that Architecture Association is a lot of theories, and there's schools that look into more on environmental science. But the graduates that come out of it is competent, wherever the school's direction is, because they're confident. They're confident about going into employment. They know how to tackle things when they are employed. And for sure, the employers will think, oh, great. They ask questions, or they are kind of independent, or they know what to do. They're not waiting around and, shall we say, wasting time and stuff like that. So this is how individuals who studied architecture for 3 years or 5 years, and they go out and trying to search employment and also fulfillment and be part of the workforce and be part of an architecture studio, and everybody needs to be happy, right? But many people aren't. So that was the popular opinion, we know. So I'm linking that dumbing down architecture and those series of podcasts that I've done recently with the March one with Kevin Matlow, and in particular part 2. Just listen in and you can see that. You can see that these are the 3 things that are important for us to look whenever there is a problem with architecture education, which is formalism, why we should not be obsessed with it, the power of relationships, and what architecture is about when you look at it carefully, and third, which is the guidance. So when any of 3 of these, the excessive formalism, you're gonna be dumbing down on the education in your school of architecture. If the students don't understand the power of relationships and what is the most important thing in their project, you're dumbing down the architecture education. And the third one, when there is lack of the proper guidance, not hero worshipping, not relegating or, shall we say, passing your work to other people and not doing the right work, and getting your students to actually gain confidence through the skills, through the process of learning, then you are really dumbing down on the architecture education in your schools, unfortunately. So be mindful of this, because yes, it can be cover up. It can be, say, the students can get A's, but the effect that the student will carry to the employment, whether they're confident or not to be in the office. And that's a shame, really, because, hey, you have somebody graduating, but they are not good enough. That is reflect upon your school of architecture, that you didn't do the job properly. And this is a reminder for those academics out there. Yes, we need to be passionate about this topic, so we are. Thank you again for listening to another episode on Talk Architecture. I will see you again in the next episode. Take care.